Yep, thank you for the introduction. I'm Lachlan Urquhart from the University of Nottingham, and today I'll be talking about the concept of user-centric regulation and how that can help with understanding some of the challenges stemming from the domestic Internet of Things. And I should say that my background is in law, but also in sort of human-computer interaction, so that's the kind of perspective I'm coming from here. So what I've noticed is a increasing trend within regulation to kind of look towards those who are creating these technologies to deal with a lot of the challenges stemming from them, particularly around privacy. So we've seen this kind of emerging concept of privacy by design for quite a while now. But a challenge that I was kind of looking into was, whilst we're turning to that community, I think there's a greater need to better situate the role of the IT design community within regulation. And within this talk, I'll run through 4 perspectives that I've looked at in detail through my research. So firstly, sort of conceptual perspective. So that's going to look at how to kind of bridge the gap between the HCI community and the IT law community, and to what extent there's scope to align the perspectives from these respective disciplines. Then I'll look at some legal perspectives through some case studies from the IoT, so smart metering and domestic IoT more generally. And then thirdly, I'll go through some empirical work I'd done, sort of doing interviews with designers and lawyers to try and get a sense of the challenges of doing privacy by design for the Internet of Things in practice. And lastly, I'll introduce a design tool that I created with, as part of a project to kind of help develop, to evaluate some of the issues that stem from doing privacy by design in practice. So for a while now in IT law, there's been this recognition that the design of technology, its architecture, can be utilised as a regulatory tool. So there's been some theorists like Joel Reidenberg back in the late 90s who kind of first coined this, and most famously Lawrence Lessig with his aphorism, code is law, where he's basically arguing that alongside other modalities of regulating, such as the market, social norms, and law themselves, the architecture of a system can be quite a useful tool. And what we're seeing at the same time, some of the political theory is that regulation as a concept is expanding quite significantly. So Julia Black at the LSE has kind of argued that we've moved towards this post-regulatory state where there's a greater number of actors involved in regulation for a range of different purposes. So a lot more non-state actors beyond the government who are shaping the behaviour of individuals, setting standards, and so forth. And the way in which sort of design is conceptualised often within the law and within Lessig's model and others is that that the user is being acted upon. They have very little agency. They're just being there, almost as he uses the language of pathetic dots. So they don't have a great deal of control over what happens to them. And Andrew Murray, who's kind of built on Lessig's work, he looks at this concept of how you have a community of people interacting and how they'll respond to regulatory interventions. He talks of people as being nodes. So again, we're sort of seeing a language that's very much at an abstracted level. And this was a basis for arguing that, well, instead of these sort of more social systems theory models, maybe we could look at how users actually interact with technologies in practice and build a much deeper understanding of the citizen who's being regulated by these different technologies and different mediums. So this has prompted the turn towards HCI as a discipline because it focuses very much on developing this kind of very situated understanding of users. Hello.
What does pathetic dots mean?
That's the language that Lawrence Lessig used to describe the actor, the individual who's being regulated. So he talked about these four modalities of law, the ones I'd mentioned, and basically they act upon a pathetic dot. So the individual who's being regulated is conceived as a dot, as opposed to an active person who has agency and so forth. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. So within HCI, you're kind of seeing a broadening to considering the societal implications of computing. So the so-called third wave of HCI looks at the kind of cultural and emotional dimensions of computing and how they're ingrained in different parts of everyday life. So going beyond the kind of desktop model where we're focusing on maybe increasing the performance of a device or the usability, but looking more widely as to the broader context in which computing is embedded. And within that, you've kind of got concepts like reflective design, which are trying to understand how the designers themselves kind of think more about the broader implications of what they're creating. And as was mentioned by Hamid earlier, the sort of concept of human data interaction is one that's been developed in thinking about how you put the user at the core of all these concerns and how the responsibilities to them manifest in the design of technologies. And then there's more formal frameworks, the likes of value-sensitive design, which is seeking to bring a lot of these broader social values into the creation of technology, so looking at things like sustainability or, again, security and privacy. But trying to expand this within my work, I've been looking to see how can we bring in legal values to the fore as well. And I think a key dimension here is that within the HCI community, the user is obviously critical, and there's been a range of different tools and approaches developed to thinking about how technologies impact upon end users, so things like design ethnographies, participatory design processes, releasing prototypes in the wild, and so forth. And I think a particularly interesting one is if you look back to the roots of participatory design and to the Scandinavian school where it originated. So this was a response to basically when they were putting in place new IT systems in workplaces, kind of actually taking stock of the legal framework in Scandinavia where workers have to have a greater input into the way in which the systems were designed so that they could kind of realise this goal of workplace democracy, so that their workplace was somewhere that they felt it was a rewarding place to go to, and this was part of the sort of the labour law framework there. And I think that interaction between sort of the politics, because a lot of this research was led by trade unions at that time there, so it's kind of looking to see, bringing together the politics, the law and the design, and how that impacted the end result of the technologies. So yeah, the terminology of user-centric regulation is trying to pull together these different perspectives and saying if we have an explicit alignment between HCI and IT law, how can we build from that position and try and look at how we could sort of structure reflection and action by designers on these legal responsibilities, and try and find different mechanisms to sort of support reflection on these legal, ethical responsibilities, but also how to kind of bring in legal concerns earlier in the design of new technologies. And a key dimension is by focusing on this sort of proximity to end users within the HCI community, that might be a way of giving greater legitimacy to them as non-state actors who are involved in the practice of regulation. So yes, and I think a key dimension is going beyond compliance and thinking about these kind of wider, how are you doing compliance, what was the ethical dimensions of that. So getting onto the Internet of Things more specifically and trying to think about these concepts within that context. If we look at the Internet of Things, this is the most recent term that's being used, but there's quite a long trajectory of different trends that have been in the past 30 years, from ubiquitous computing in the early 90s, pervasive computing, ambient intelligence, and they've all kind of focused on dimensions of embedding computing in different contexts and in a more ambient way so that they can sense about and try and kind of gain this contextual awareness. And I think a challenge there is that with these visions, for example, with ubiquitous computing of invisibility in use, that was one of the kind of key goals, was to make computing invisible in use. You kind of get very much bounded up with the vision and how you go around engineering that vision. But again, a challenge that was raised with a lot of that work was you neglect the present, so you kind of focus on these future-gazing activities, but you don't actually deal with the present day. But equally, the interests of users are often lost within this. So with some of the sort of more technically orientated smart home research, that there's not necessarily the interests of the users being manifest there. But again, with IoT, you see a range of different application areas, which I think a key element to consider is the setting in which a lot of them are put. So if we're talking about the home, appreciating the sort of social complexity of the home as a place where there's a range of different routines and hierarchies and politics between different members from family, and if you're flat shares with people and things like that. So I think designing and remembering that that's the domain in which the technologies will operate is quite important. And I'll come back to this, but I think there's also a lot of work that's beyond the more utilitarian applications of IoT, which may be to sort of better manage your energy or kind of have lighting that's more context aware, but kind of looking at the creative side too, and how these objects can kind of be used to track stories and tell stories and things. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So yeah, despite there not being a sort of canonical vision here, kind of looking across a range of different reports about the IoT from the International Telecoms Union, Cisco, the EU Article 29 Working Party, you get a sense of the sort of things they're meaning by IoT. So, remote controllability and automation are two key elements. You'll often manage a lot of these devices like your Nest thermostat through your phone in addition to the actual interface on the device. The element of sort of constant connectivity and back-end networking is a key element, especially from a regulatory perspective. The broad range of stakeholders involved in this, third parties, and the flows of information to them. And again, the materiality, so the actual fact that there's physical objects being embedded in often quite intimate spaces within the home, depending on what rooms you're talking about, whether it's the bathroom, if we're talking about sort of smart toilets and things like that, versus the bedroom, smart beds. So, and I think a key element is also the fact that there may or may not be an interface in a lot of these. So how you present information from a legal perspective can be quite challenging. And again, legally, the sort of, as Ahmed showed earlier with the graph around the smart meters, the detailed inferences that can be derived about everyday life from a lot of these devices is a challenge. But equally, given the design and the fact that they're often, like with the Nest, they're very aesthetically pleasing, but there's not a great deal of transparency as to how the information has been collected or used to, say, build up the profile of your movement, so you can determine when it's best to switch on and off the heating. So I think that's a challenge there from a legal side. Similarly, the way in which a lot of these are designed, with the fact that back-end cloud storage is used, you're dealing with international data transfer there. So, if we're talking in an EU context, if it's going to a third country, you'll have to have an adequacy decision as to the appropriateness of the data protection regime in that country. The heterogeneity of the device interfaces means that even if users can get a sense as to how one is working, they may not be able to apply that mental model across different devices in the home. And that, again, will shape their ability to control access to that data. And similarly, the sort of repurposing of the information. It may be collected for one very specific purpose, but then it might have completely different uses when it's purposed for others. So again, the solution is privacy by design, often the one that's coined in these discussions is, we need to kind of draw on the traction that's emerging with Article 25 of the Data Protection Regulation, which puts in place provisions for technical and organisational measures to be put in place that take stock of the state-of-the-art, costs, severity of risks for data controllers who are handling personal information, personal data. And again, this has a trajectory if we look back at the work in sort of usable privacy and security and privacy engineering. And whilst this is gaining quite a lot of popularity in legal circles, if this is a tool to support designers in dealing with ethical and legal dimensions of their work, these quotes I think are quite nice. So one says, whereas for lawyers, privacy by design seems an intuitive and sensible policy tool, for information system developers and engineers, it's anything but intuitive. And similarly, Groups and Leans have highlighted the fact that maybe we should focus on fostering the right mindset of those responsible for developing and running data processing systems. So as we'll come to later, some of this work is looking to see, well, within the HCI community, how can we foster engagement with legal issues? And this is trying to give some examples. So if we look at some concepts that are popular within HCI, how can they be repurposed to deal with legal issues? So the right to be forgotten, it's quite a well-publicised element of the GDPR, or the right to erasure, it's now called. But if we look at some work that's emerging in HCI, so this notion of object provenance. So this picture of the guitar here is a project that's going on at Nottingham, where the guitar, these are art, well, they're called art codes, and they're effectively like QR codes, but they're more creatively designed. And what happens is content can be tagged to each of these codes. So when you scan them, you'll maybe get a video loading up as to someone that was playing the guitar at a festival, and the idea is to build up a story of how this guitar moves through the world. And similarly, I have a colleague who's doing work with the Warhammer 40k community and how you can augment figurines with the stories and the sort of practices that go along with that community as to how you curate collections, how you paint them, and things like that. And it's kind of looking more at the sort of an object-centric narrative. So how can we utilise this kind of perspective in thinking about the balancing exercise that might have to go on in thinking about right to be forgotten actions? Will this give us a greater appreciation of the cultural heritage that these objects might have when balancing these against rights? So it's just a way of kind of changing the more polarised debate that's often gone on with the right to be forgotten, which is very much censorship versus privacy. Another one is the notion of trajectories from Benford et al. And this is a framework for thinking about how you design user experiences. So when you are breaking it down into sort of 4 elements that you should think about when you're designing user experience. So if we were to think about how you would maybe design a user consent mechanism with an IoT device like a smart thermostat. So if you think about the space, this is one of the elements. So we're talking about the home, then that again brings to the fore lots of these questions as to the contested nature of the social space, who has permissions to touch these, the kids might not be able to touch it, but the parents are. Actors, in terms of, if you run your home also as an Airbnb, you might have transient visitors who are coming and going. The interface itself, so what kind of affordances does the device have for, say, you want to signify you signal your consent. You could do waving, you could have beeps, you could have some sort of feedback between the device and you, so you could create more contextually appropriate consent mechanisms than, say, the default, which is currently terms and conditions and lots of text which no one reads. Lastly, time. So if you're going to have this device embedded in your home for a long period of time, you have a very longitudinal relationship. So you might not need to put all that information up front at the beginning. You might be able to scaffold it throughout the relationship. So it's just another way of trying to think about, well, if we can draw on these concepts from HCI, how can they help us deal with some of the sort of legal questions too? How am I doing for time? Okay. So this is going on to some, going out and speaking to people to see as to what perspectives there are around doing privacy by design for the Internet of Things in practice. So this was some work I'd done with interviews with practicing lawyers and technologists, often at more sort of strategic level at this point. And this is just the paper that's got some of the findings in there. And this was trying to lay out some of the different perspectives that they had from their own work. So something that came up was around privacy by design, doing privacy by design, the fact that organizations have a differentiated level of resources they can dedicate to dealing with this. So, within SMEs, there's a real challenge there that they might not have the investment to kind of do a strategic oversight as to how we'll put in place compliance mechanisms. They might not have the resources or the sort of strategic stability there, versus multinationals who might have the ability to kind of put in place more systematic processes. Equally, they may have internal advice-giving organisations, so they might have compliance departments that people can go to if they have questions as to, is the way we're creating this technology compliant or not? Whereas again, within SMEs and startups, that's probably not the case. They discussed the way in which the business model around a lot of IoT devices is very much, try and get a cheaper device but monetize the personal data. So you'll often end up stockpiling, sending it back to the back end for analytics and trying to derive some sort of value from the patterns that can be observed. And again, it's just realizing this is the reality that the compliance has to operate within. A motivating factor, more so than compliance in of itself, is often the protection of brand values and kind of the fear of hacks and scandals and things like that. And again, a motivation being, if you can make a better product as opposed to, yeah. So I think within the terminology of privacy by design itself, there was a great degree of uncertainty as to what does that actually mean, what does that require. And some of the technologists were arguing, well, you probably need to have some sort of contextualization for different sectors as to how we would do that for autonomous vehicles or sort of smart grid sector. And if you can try and build up some sort of best practice guidelines and so forth around what that might mean for different sectors, that can give a bit more value to the concept. Something that was quite interesting was with some of the legal specialists I spoke to, they were kind of talking about how the smartphones are still quite useful as a mediating device. So yeah, you might have these different thermostats and smoke alarms and so forth embedded around the home, but the smartphone is still a good site in which to kind of display information, and despite the heterogeneity of the interfaces on these devices, you can still utilize the phone. Something that was quite interesting was the way in which a lot of the lawyers were kind of saying they had to be quite commercially minded again, with IoT being quite an emergent industry, to kind of not be too strict in their interpretations, and they were kind of pointing to the value of things like opinions from the Article 29 Working Party. So that's an advisory body, for anyone who's not familiar, at the EU level, who when new technologies come out, they give out opinions as to how the data protection framework might apply to these new technologies. And they were saying often, there might not be an absolute match between the opinions and the actual technologies they're advising on, but it can be enough to kind of give a degree of certainty there. I think something that's I've got the same cartoon again. Something that came out quite a few times was there's been a lot of discussions as to what is or what isn't IoT, and that can kind of divert attention a lot of the time, and instead focusing on the sort of the applications, the context of use can be more useful as opposed to, again, the vision. So that was quite interesting, that correlated with the sort of theoretical work at the start, that they were saying visions aren't particularly useful a lot of the time. Something that came from the design side was, again, the conflicting nature of the work that the designers are often doing. So the technologies are being pulled in many different ways between the business case, the marketing, sort of compliance, security, usability. So within that, privacy by design is just another element to be considered. So it's important to remember how complex the role is that they're trying to do. And a challenge was also, a lot of the lawyers had raised the issue that they had to kind of contextualize the relevance of law to designers. So in ways in which, formulation of internal codes of practice, how they could maybe translate standards, scenario-based approaches. So this was just all kind of get a better idea as to what might we do with privacy by design in practice. So the last bit is a design intervention that we created to try and help deal with some of these issues in maybe a more structured way. So this is some work that's been done in collaboration with partners at Microsoft Research Cambridge and also University of Edinburgh. And it was kind of responding to the challenge that you want to raise awareness as to what the law is, you want to kind of support engagement by these communities with law, but equally, 200-page GDPR is not going to be the most accessible entry point. So we've done some work in translating the law into a deck of ideation cards which have been used in workshops with different teams of designers and different organisations, again to try and get a sense of the practical challenges that they face in dealing with compliance. So let's just give a quick breakdown of the cards. So as I say, they try to translate the new GDPR, which is going to be enforced from next May. So on to your left or right? Left. Well, that one there, the legal principles, so that's kind of your traditional data protection principles around lawful processing, so things like obtaining informed and unambiguous consent, ensuring that you're only collecting data for specific purposes, minimising what you collect in the first place if possible. The next one's focusing on the new rights that have come in with the new legislation, so things like the right to erasure, the right to data portability is another one. If you're unhappy with the way one data controller is handling your information, you can contact them to get it in a format that you can then move it to another if you want to. The designer responsibilities, so this is things like data protection impact assessments that have to be conducted on sort of more high-risk projects where they'll have to go systematically through establishing what the different risks are, the safeguards that might be put in place and so forth. International considerations is around, again, these issues of cloud computing. As if you have data that's being stored in the US, that's a sort of compliance issue to consider. And the last one was just some definitions to try and help what is personal data and what is a data controller and things. So these were tested with, on the basis of this research, with three organisations. So with a large media company, sort of startup SME body with a range of different startups coming along to the workshops, and a small tech business trade association. And there was 24 participants. And that table just gives a sense of, well, it's kind of not as clear as it's clearer here. So you had a range of people. So it was targeted toward designers, but you actually got quite an unusual split. So there was quite a lot of people who came along from sort of management, business strategy, but primarily it was still technology design. So software engineers, IT consultants, programming, cybersecurity experts, and so forth. And then a few researchers too. And we ran a workshop with them, so the idea was that you get the group together and you'd say, well, we'll have to come up with a hypothetical system. So they draw one of the cards, which might be to create an autonomous vehicle or a sort of intelligent billboard that will go in a city. And then to think about a specific user, so this could be children or it could be elderly people, and trying to get discussion going as to how that might change the shape of the design. Constraints, so it could be things such as limited networking capabilities, or you have to keep it a low-cost system. And then at the end, introducing the legal dimensions. So you also have to ensure that this implements the right to erasure. So if it's an intelligent billboard in a public place, what kind of interaction method might you do to swipe once you've left, so that there's none of your information left behind, or things like that. And this was just the analysis of the findings from across these workshops. So within the SMEs, we were trying to get a sense of what are the motivations for even thinking about privacy, again with privacy by design. So with the SMEs, it was primarily around necessity. So there were some interesting discussions there as to, often they'll have to go away and read a legal framework. So there was one company was saying, we'll have to go away and read the Carriage of Goods Act. So something like this tool was quite useful as an accessible entry point to quite a complex legal framework. Again, similarly with the interviews, protection of reputation, bad publicity, they were quite big motivations for thinking about privacy and legislation. Often we saw within the workshops quite rich discussions around legal concepts, but not necessarily using legal language. But again, the sort of legal authority of, this is the law was often something that came to the fore. People were arguing that we really do need to deal with this. It's more so than ethics. This isn't best practice. This is something that's mandated. So there was quite interesting discussions within one of the larger organisations which actually had an internal advice-giving body, and they were sort of saying that the employees were saying this would be quite a useful tool for us before we go to this body to know the issues we might face. So they felt it was quite an empowerment for them, and again for the small businesses they saw it as a more easy entry point. So this, again, we were trying to get a sense of what existing support mechanisms are there for these organisations for dealing with compliance and privacy and so forth. And within the SMEs, it was quite interesting how much their sort of face-to-face social network was key to them. So they would kind of go to their peers and ask, we're having this issue in terms of collecting too much information, or we're not sure where to store it, and so forth. And they would have a very kind of physical network. They didn't rely so much on things like LinkedIn or social networks. But something that came out was, whilst doing the workshops, by the end people were saying these are good for raising awareness, but quite an enjoyable tool to use. But equally, with the SMEs in particular, they were kind of, well, what do we do next? What's a roadmap for further action, and how do we engage with that? The ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, they were sort of saying they didn't find advice often that useful. So what other tools might there be to support them thinking further about the sort of privacy issues that their technologies might raise? And again, this is just to kind of give a sense of some of the responses that they had when they were going through the discussion. So granularity management was one that came up quite a lot. So there would be a discussion as to, well, we'll just reduce the level at which you can look at the information. Things such as, internal granularity, so you might not allow occupants of the home to see certain information versus what third parties might be able to see. Again, security came out as being quite understandably a big concern, but more so sometimes in privacy, especially within SMEs. There was a lot of fear around security dimensions. And I think there was something interesting around the sort of pragmatic responses we often saw. So, with issues around international data transfer, a lot of the responses, well, we'll just keep it locally, we won't put it in the cloud. That was kind of very much the answer. Once the awareness had been raised as to this being an issue, that was kind of like, or if we do have to do international data transfer, then we'll need to factor in the costs of passing it by the legal team and so forth. Similarly, with consent mechanisms, there was awareness that, yes, we can present this information to end users, but comprehension is actually the key. They wanted to make sure that people were properly understanding. So yeah, it was just to kind of give an overview as to the different levels where we can try and support this concept of bringing together the design community, the legal community, and different tools and approaches we can do that with. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
Hello. I wonder if there's just so much distributed artificial intelligence in things, and they sort of interact, that it's really possible to do this kind of human-centric, kind of regulatory sort of design of things. So as an example, right? So say I'm at home and it's really hot, and I've designed my ventilation system. So if I wave right at it, it sort of cools it down. If I do another gesture, it warms it up. Now it's too cold for me, right? Despite it being a hot day, so I'm triggering it with the gesture to sort of increase the temperature, but it refuses to do it, and it's refusing to do it because it's detected my computer's overheated, so it wants to keep the room cool to preserve the life or to preserve the mode of my computer. So, this kind of like conflict and all of these like decisions is kind of hard for us to keep track of and control and maybe even understand the entire time. I just wonder if you've got any sort of thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think as part of the rationale for arguing that you need a better understanding as to how people actually interact with these technologies in practice. So with a lot of the regulatory mechanisms that are being designed, they might not have an awareness as to the way in which people actually use these technologies. And I think similarly, there might be processes within design for, if you're doing sort of a co-design or a participatory design process where you'll know the different settings that technology might be used in. So you maybe have an awareness, or you can start to get an awareness as to these sort of issues coming to the fore, that depending on environmental, when it's a warm day, this might be an issue. And I think it's just basically trying to bring legal concerns into that discussion as well, because at the moment that's maybe more orientated towards how you make a better product or how you make it more suitable for different design settings, but also bringing in the fact that these users have rights, so they might not like the fact that information is being sent to different parts of the world, or they might not even have an awareness to that, and they might desire more control over these things. So yeah, I'm not sure if that necessarily answers the question, but
just sort of one short response. I mean, maybe that's quite difficult to do, even that, because it's just such an open environment. You know, the designers can't envisage every possible interlinking of something.
Of course, yeah, and it's not necessary to get every single, but I think it's just to start, because I think at the moment, as far as I'm aware, at least from the research, that doesn't happen at all. So it's just to kind of get that conversation started and the dialogue between these communities and finding ways to do that, because the current state seems to be that that's not happening at all, or in very limited contexts anyway. So yeah, it's just to try, you know, perhaps in the future, yeah, it might be possible to kind of anticipate all different consequences, but at this stage it's just to even think about some of the consequences that might arise, and this might be a way of doing it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yep.
You mentioned various initiatives like privacy by design and a kind of European framework.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me to contrast that with the talk earlier about the European legislation around biometrics, which is much more privacy invasive, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wondered what we should make of this. I mean, it looks like, I mean, you know, the European Union is a big organization. The European Commission is a big organization. It's not surprising that different parts of it are saying different things about such a complex subject. But it does look like it's inconsistent, right? I mean, on the one hand, they want to have a lot of biometric data and they want to control that. On the other hand, they want companies who are making IoT devices to respect privacy by design. Maybe that's simply because they haven't woken up to the possible exploitation that they could do of IoT data, and that when they do wake up to that, they'll be more inclined to collect that data than to recommend privacy by design. Just wondered whether you had thoughts around this issue and whether these kind of recommendations that we're having now are likely to be stable or to change in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think in terms, it's an interesting contrast, and I think the sort of invasiveness of a lot of the biometric, yeah, so the sort of higher framework is probably necessary, whereas I think the fact that the GDPR is to apply in so many different contexts and it's, yeah, so I think that there could be an issue there. I mean, there is provisions within it around biometric information and the harmonisation of, I mean, for example, with the biometrics, it's much more at a state level, whereas this is going to be applying to non-state actors as well. So I think that could be partly why you might have to have the sort of stronger provisions in place for the biometric systems versus this, which has got a more holistic application beyond just state organisations. So I think to me that could be perhaps where the split might be. And it's maybe a not as intensive a regime because of that fact that, you know, can't necessarily expect that for all organisations to. But yeah, I think definitely the consistency across different regulatory frameworks is a real challenge to reconcile, for sure.
Any other questions? If this is not the case, thanks again, Lasha.
Thank you.